Good morning, family and friends, and yes, today's title of the message is Steadfast and Security, and we will be focused on today's scripture in the book of Psalms in chapter 11. Book of Psalms in chapter 11. We begin in verse 1. To the choir master of David, in the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to your mountain? For behold, the wicked bend their bow. They have fitted their arrow to the string, to shoot in the dark at the upright and hard. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyelids test the children of men. The Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. Let him rain coals on the wicked. Fire and sulfur and a scorching wind shall be the portion of their cup. The Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face. Let us pray. God, we thank you for today. We thank you for this gathering. I pray, God, that you would bring to light and illuminate our hearts and our minds, and also to bring unity among us as we turn to your scripture for direction, for hope, and for strength. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen. Now, many of you may not know me too well, or perhaps some of you are guests today. But I can relate by simply saying that we're all human. I think we can agree with that. So as a fellow human, I think we would all also agree that we also have this desire for stability. And stability is normally synonymous with this idea of security. However, we base our stability and our security mostly sometimes on our emotions. So guess what? Once we are not emotionally stable, therefore we have lost all sense of stability in our lives. Fortunately, I witnessed this firsthand, and also those who I got to walk alongside the side of heaven. Perhaps we find stability and desire for financial stability. Perhaps we base our stability on the size of our office and the size of our paychecks. Perhaps we also find stability with the rings around our fingers that symbolize faithfulness. Perhaps you're a student and you work diligently and you maintain your security by the grade that you receive in the course that you take. Perhaps you're a child or once were a child and you find security in a home that both your parents love you quite dearly. However, we hear this statement often. Sounds cliche. Life happens. Normally that follows negative. That is, what happens when our office shrinks as fast as our paychecks? What happens when the ring that used to symbolize faithfulness now symbolizes unfaithfulness? What happens when the student who believes they did not get the GPA that they deserve is much lower than what they perceived or hoped for? What happens when, although the child may be loved by both the parents, it is now in the context of mom's week and dad's week? To be honest, it doesn't have to be these major circumstances that shake our stability. Sometimes our routines can be shaken up as well. For example, maybe you didn't have your coffee this morning and you have lost your sense of stability. It sounds silly, but we are creatures of habit. We are human, and therefore we are needy. We give into fragile hope. However, the question that we begin to ask then is, can we truly have a sense of stability? Can we have a real sense of security? Well, as we turn to scriptures today, I hope that we find such comfort. That I want to encourage you that whatever your daily rhythms may be, whether it be in classrooms, whether it be in your vocations, whether it be in your households, that you will truly find security. And the focus is this main point that I want to highlight. that God has laid a firm foundation so that our hope will not be shaken. That is the main point that I want to cover today. That God has laid a firm foundation so that your hope will not be shaken. And we're going to begin to see this in three ways. First, I want to begin by addressing our securities. Second, I would like to situate our securities. And lastly, where the other 2 points will flow from, is the saving security. So let's begin by relating to this passage, which is, how does this Psalm 11 relate to history and to Scripture as a whole? Now, when we approach Psalms, we have to also recognize that it is comprised of 150 separate compositions. It's not written all at one time. Matter of fact, the earliest psalm is written by Moses, Psalm 90, and it stretches all the way to post-exilic times, which covers a span of 1,000 years. One scholar says that from this perspective, the historical background of the Psalms is the history of the nation of Israel. His main point is saying that we shouldn't approach the book of Psalms so much of when it was written, because that would be an endless task. Scholars are still trying to figure it out. Guess what? We can't figure it out precisely on exact dating, but let me suggest that we are to focus on why it was written. That is, the Psalms deal primarily with matters of worship. They were used by God's people for everyday worship and the formal gathering of worship of God in ancient Israel. Second, I think it's also helpful before we begin to situate the book of Psalms exactly where it is placed in Scriptures as a whole. This is obvious, but it's a good point that we can see that it's placed in the Old Testament. And we can appreciate the psalmist's approach in describing God's richness, the richness of God's character and his attributes in the genre of poetry. But we also need to recognize that we see the fulfillment in the New Testament, namely in Jesus Christ. So by keeping this in mind, let's begin by our first point, that is addressing our securities. The book of Psalms, again, was written by a number of authors. Today, this psalm that we read is written by David, who actually wrote 73 of the 150 psalms. And when we think of David, sometimes we think of David as the young shepherd boy, or we may think of him as already this established king of Israel, or perhaps we see him in his sin and misery, proximity with his sins with Bathsheba. But the passage today, I think it is helpful to identify David as the rising king and the fall of Saul. And in this passage, David will address how we will respond in a collapsing world. And he will address this with a little help from his friends. So we hear David's friends' good advice. Where I want to start with this idea of addressing our securities. You see, in verses 2 and 3, we see that David's men is focused on their circumstance. That is, they see that the enemy is prepared to attack. They have their bows bent. They are aiming right at the heart. And it brings a lot of their concern. However, the mountain they point to reveals also what they have placed their hope in. It makes known that they base their stability what they base their stability will be proven that it will be shaken. That is, what they advise David is to set your hope in your mountain. That is, find your safety in elsewhere than in God. It is a mountain that finds its temporary fulfillment only to be overcome by the threat of the enemy. So what David's men, although they may intend offering advice, they see obvious threat. What they actually do is they mistakenly advise David to act like foreigners to their God and to forsake all that God has promised to them in the past. Now, let's try to sympathize with David's men. They're trying to be reasonable to him. That is, we can hear them say, David, we can hear them bending their bow. They don't mean to wound us. They are trying to kill us. Practically speaking, that's some good sound advice to me. And I would love to flee to my mountain. However, they are not struck. What strikes them, what motivates them, is actually their fear of man. They undermine David's leadership to seek refuge and shelter in their own means. However, you see David's stability early on in this psalm. Up front, he says, how can you say to my soul? And he says that with confidence. One passage that is really helpful, don't need to turn there, but in 1 Samuel 23, verses 1 through 14, you see David's steadfast and security that will enable him to save a city of Keilah. That is, in 1 Samuel 23, David gets word that the Philistines are attacking a city. And then David's response is, he seeks God's inquiry. He said, God, what should I do? God's response, go and save the city. So David goes and tells his men, hey, let's go save the city. And what do? They are content in their fear of man. They want to stay where they're at. And furthermore, they want to push David and say, why would we want to go and save this city? You know, we're in fear where we're at. Why would we go into fear? Why would we go in harm's way? So David, as a patient and loving king, he goes and intercedes on behalf and goes back to the Lord and says, Lord, should we save the city? And the Lord gives him the answer. He says, save the city, and I will actually give the enemy into your hand. And sure enough, that's what happens. But this is the most interesting part. It's critical to that bears light in this and back into how does David find confidence in saying, how can you say to my soul? It's what happens afterwards. So the established king Saul, in his jealousy, hears David's victory. And he gathers all the armies that he has and he wants to besiege David in this city. In the same city that David saved, the inhabitants in that city, they give David up. Like, he just saved them. So David is left with this predicament. Should he apply exactly what he just learned just recently? That God will give him victory in his own insight? Or should he go and continue to depend on God and ask for his help again? So, as we continue to read, David actually does go back to God and ask for his inquiry. And guess what? It's quite different than what we would assume would apply. God actually advises him to flee. Flee to the wilderness. Now, if you heard that as an Israelite, like, wait a minute. Last time I went to the wilderness, it was because of disobedience. Here, you want to say, is that an obedience? But once again, it's David focusing on God and his inquiry. What we learn from David is his refuge is not found in his own understanding. It is not in his circumstance or the advice from his friends, but the inquiry of the Lord, who he says he is a servant to. What we learn is that we are not to find our identity in our circumstance, but in the God that we serve. One historian in the 17th century highlights David's character in this way. How is it possible that birds of so different a feather should also fly together as to meet in the character of David? To whom we answered that no two men can more differ one from the other, that the same servant of God has several times differeth from himself, David in prosperity, David in prosperity when commanding was like an eagle. In adversity, when contemned, like an owl. In devotion, when retired, like a pelican. In solitariness, when having no company of Saul like a partridge. This general metaphor of a bird, which David so often used on himself, his enemies in the first verse of the psalm used on him. Though not particularizing the kind thereof, flee as a bird to your mountain. That is, this is the point, speedily betake thyself to thy God, in whom you hope for in security. So what we find insight is, we find our insecurities and relate to our securities by what David's men have made known. That is, recall the last time you were in a conflict. What did you place your hope and security in? However, even when we fail to seek God and to hear from Him, even take heed to His instruction, David teaches us that it's never too late to cry out to God. That He, in fact, hears our prayers, hears our cries, even when we don't turn to Him. Another Psalm of David, in Psalm 27, he tells us, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" And he ends with this counsel, that wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Family, friends, and guests, we are to wait for the Lord to answer. Indeed, He answered. You see, we can relate because in 1 Corinthians 1:18, we know that the cross is folly to those who don't believe, but it is actually the power of God for those who do. That those who are being rescued and being saved is actually our power. It actually empowers us. 2 Corinthians 5 actually tells us what to look to. We should look according to the flesh, but according to our new creation. That is, we need to identify one another, ourselves, those who put their hope and trust in God. We need to identify one another in Christ. We need to be identified by the good news, is my point. So when we are addressing our securities, a good way to pinpoint exactly where do we land in our faith is this idea is, are we known for our good advice? Basically, to tell of our experiences, of what we learned in the past? Or are we primarily known by the good news that we know in Jesus Christ? And as we move forward, I hope that we do name these insecurities by name. That we, not only that, but we actually go and ask God for help. That we actually go and ask for one another for advice and guidance. And how do we exactly become known as good news people and not so much as good advice people? This brings us to the second point, that we are to situate our securities. What do I mean by this? Perhaps you say you are a Christian, that you are grounded in Jesus Christ, that your hope is this, that it is Jesus Christ, His birth, His life, His death, His resurrection, His ascension. However, we see sometimes these lines blur to how we respond to life, to how God responds to life. Another way to say that, and frame it, is sometimes we blur the lines between our works and His works. In Proverbs, it speaks of the wicked and the wisdom very black and white. It is very certain on these are the ways of the wise and righteous, and these are the ways of the wicked. However, put that in practice, life sometimes doesn't seem very black and white. Sometimes we meet Christians that say a word, but their deeds don't match the word. Quite honestly, sometimes I've met some very moral atheists that are more moral than I would be. So we need to focus, to remember our present predicament. That is, how do we find comfort in the salvation even when we continue to sin? How do we climb out of the valley of sin, and how do we begin to climb in the mountain of God? Psalm 11, here again, David helps us and points us to this direction. That is, in verse 5, we see that the Lord tests the righteous. That the righteous here are described as hating the wicked and hating those who do violence. The righteous are also described as the Lord loving their deeds. However, the wicked, it's a little different. That is, their wicked path ends in God's judgment. In verse 6, it brings us back to Genesis 19. That when the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And the events of Sodom and Gomorrah serve as a picture of a greater and final judgment that the wicked will indeed face. This should really trouble us because the fate of the righteous and the wicked is quite clear. However, when we do evil things and we claim to be righteous, what will be our fate? How do you find security even when we fail and seem to fall? I love how Psalm 11 kind of gives us a perspective, gives us a way to see or pinpoint exactly where can we find our security. That is, notice what the wicked and the righteous behold. Verse 2 through verse 3, we see the wicked, they behold their circumstance. And their circumstance is the enemy is at hand, and the enemy seems that they will win, and they will be destroyed. They will be killed if they don't move. And it ends with this very sobering question, is if the foundations are destroyed, what can righteous do? What can righteous do? Absolutely nothing. We come before God, recognizing our need, and recognizing that we are empty without His help. But look at what the righteous behold. The very last thing it leaves, that the upright shall behold His face. That is, they are consumed in the awe of God and His glory. That they're all consumed in devotion. All their senses and desires are focused on God, who is, in verse 4, in His temple. He sits on His throne in heaven. And I love how Scripture kind of situates us today. That the Lord actually does dwell in His holy temple. See, as David's friends focus on the circumstance, which is chaotic, and you can't tell exactly the outcome, David here, he focused on the Lord who is in heaven. And for us, we need to see what lens do we put on. Do we put on the lens of the wicked, or do we put on the lens of the righteous? When we put on the lens of the wicked or righteous, it actually leads in oddly the same point. It is just putting our circumstances as our context. That is, we're limited to our horizon. Circumstances become our center, they become what surrounds us, it becomes what we decide to do. However, what we really do too is when we put our works, the lens of the wicked and righteous, we actually put the gospel in the background. And how we put the gospel in the foreground is focusing on what God has done. That's what David did. He focused on the Lord as on His holy temple. He situates himself there. He situates himself with the Lord in His heaven, that he actually can test the children of man and what their thoughts are. Is our circumstance our context, or are we going to keep Christ as our context? Before we move to the last point, recall that we began to address our securities. That is, are we to be good news people, or are we more as good advice people? Then we began to kind of dig deeper and try to situate what we find our securities in. And from there, whether we focus on our works, we put the gospel in the background, or we focus on his words and put the gospel in the foreground. And this last point, once again, these first 2 points flow from, and that's how they relate. The last point is focusing on the saving security. One scholar reflects on this very passage. If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? My text is hung about with mourning, as for a funeral sermon, and contains, first, a sad case supposed. If the foundations be destroyed. Secondly, a sad question propounded. What can the righteous do? And thirdly, a sad answer implied, namely, they can do just nothing, as to the point of reestablishing the destroyed foundation. Again, family, friends, and guests. Perhaps you're a new convert to this faith, or perhaps you're well seasoned in your faith. But sometimes we think of Christianity as what we are to do, when Christianity is simply done. It's what we need to be nailed upon. What do I mean by this? 1 Corinthians 3 highlights this very point. What is our foundation? Paul talks about how he is the master builder, he is skilled. And even those who are unskilled are building upon the very same foundation. What is that foundation? No other than Jesus Christ. That no matter how skilled or unskilled we are building upon, we will not lose the security because it is Jesus Christ. I love how Spurgeon kind of offered an application to this passage and saying, if all earthly things fail, the very state fall to pieces, what can we do? We can suffer joyfully, hope cheerfully, wait patiently, pray earnestly, believe confidently, and triumph finally. We need to remember, again, our present predicament, that sin is alive, however, it will be laid to rest. So we come to understand that how David begins is where we should begin in our lives, that the Lord I take refuge. That Jesus is enough, and he's sufficient to meet our needs. He has saved us from the wrath of God, and he's secured us in salvation. Let me conclude by recapping the few points that we talked about. That is, 1, we are to be known as good news people. 2, that we are to live with the gospel in the foreground of our lives. 3, we are to be grounded by and in the gospel. And I want to end with this. That is, God has laid a firm foundation so that our hope will not be shaken. He sent his Son, and his Son is the one who laid down his life and rescues us from sin. And this is what bears reality, that even when sin causes us to be bankrupt, Jesus has put down a down payment on our behalf. That even when there is unfaithfulness in marriages, we are reminded that we are the bride, and Jesus is the faithful groom. That even when a student fails to meet the GPA that he or she wishes to reach, that we can actually ask for wisdom above. That even when homes are broken and families separate, we know that in Jesus we are found to be adopted into the family of God. Let us pray. God, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you so much for your truth. I pray, God, that as this impacts our hearts, that we respond in the gospel, Lord. Not so much what we can do, but what you already done, Lord. We thank you for today. We thank you for this body. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.